Thank you for joining us for our first episode of CES Tech Talk. I'm your host, Jeff Joseph, and today we have three fantastic guests, all experts on the ever-evolving topic of smart cities. First, we're going to talk about the trends of smart cities with CTA Steve Koenig. Then, John Kwant of Ford Smart Mobility and Frank Sgambati of Bosch will each also be joining us to dive further into this topic. Enjoy, and thanks for listening. This podcast brought to you by Dell, giving the modern workforce everything they need to securely connect, produce, and collaborate from anywhere at any time. Dell Technologies offers the industry's most comprehensive and innovative in-user portfolio, from individual workers to organizations of all sizes. Hello, and welcome to CES Tech Talk. I'm Jeff Joseph, the Senior Vice President of Communications and Strategic Relationships with the Consumer Technology Association. We're the folks who produce the annual CES, the greatest show on earth. And I'm excited today to talk with Steve Koenig, CTA's Senior Director of Research. And we're going to explore smart cities. You may have heard a lot about them. What are they? What makes a city smart? What are the challenges? In 1950, only 30% of the world's population lived in cities. By 2014, 54%. And by 2050, it's estimated that a full 2/3 of humankind, of the world population, will live in cities. Cities are evolving at the very time that technologies are growing in our life. They're connecting us and dealing with urban infrastructure, management, economic activity. Everyday life is now governed by technology in some ways. And this, in a nutshell, is sort of what lies behind this concept of smart cities, an acceleration of this urban movement at a time when technology is becoming more ubiquitous and more a part of our everyday life. If you look back over time, the sophistication of cities was once defined by the strength of infrastructure, right, the height of the buildings, the marvel of the subway system. But today, it's more about the data that's being used to better our cities and how that and address some of the key challenges. As cities expand and become more pervasive, the cities are turning to technological approaches to deal with some of these key issues: overcrowded cities, lack of resources, insufficient transportation, and so that's sort of where we'll start, right? So I guess maybe with that introduction, Steve, the first question is, given all that I just pulled out there, what makes a city smart? What is a smart city?
Well, interestingly enough, there's really no hard and fast definition for a smart city. Realistically, a smart city is defined by the citizens who live there and their requirements. But what our research has shown is that usually the place that smart cities begin is dealing with traffic congestion. Why? Because that's usually a major pain point for citizens, thinking about commuting times and trying to get around on the weekends and so forth. So when we think about the tax dollars that are often used to invest and create smart cities, the citizenry and the voters usually will endorse a plan to move forward with smart technologies that will aid with traffic congestion. Of course, the derivative benefit there is also pollution reduction. Mm-hmm. So that's another piece, I think, of the pie when we think about smart cities and what they look like today. But looking ahead into the future, we're going to see really what I would describe as a grand summation of technologies that are working in concert that are going to address every facet of city administration and services that will be to the benefit of the citizens living there.
Now, I want to touch on that point, but you and I both live in the Washington, D.C. area. I think it's certainly in the top 10, if not the top 5 of most traffic congested cities. And we live it every day, much to our chagrin, as much as we love our jobs. So are we seeing implementations here that for dealing with some of that traffic control that may be applicable to how we're seeing smart cities develop around the rest of the world?
Sure. I mean, just take a look at some of our hot lanes with the sensors thereof and the time of use billing also based on traffic and patterns. They can basically help optimize traffic flows by incentivizing it. It's pretty cheap to use these lanes at certain times, more expensive at other times.
Right.
So therefore, they can help optimize traffic flows and prevent those that gridlock that we still encounter here. I think it's a work in progress.
Some of the other elements that are going in, and we talked a little bit before we started the podcast about some of these underlying technologies that are now coming to fruition. I want to touch on those a little bit. What do you see as sort of the support? We've talked about sensors, talked about cameras. What are the other supporting technologies that are building these smart cities or that are necessary for a smart city?
Well, there are a number of ingredient technologies that really, again, sum to constitute a smart city. and a number of them we're going to start to see really in sharp relief in the next decade. That would be 5G, AI, robotics, self-driving vehicles.
IoT, Internet of Things, and the connectivity of everything. I was thinking, as you were talking, I was thinking about that we've become more and more accustomed to the Internet of Things, the connectivity in our homes. You probably have the data right at your fingertips, but we know that we've seen an increase in sales and usage of smart thermostats, of home security cameras, and the AI devices, the talking computers, if you will, the Alexas, the Google's Homes. So does that? One question is, do you think, as a researcher, does that portend well then for consumers' acceptance of smart cities? And two, is there a connection there? Can that data that we use in our homes, our apartments, whatever, that smart home technology, does that then equate to or connect to or help build the infrastructure for the smart city?
I think it does, and you're right. I mean, IoT is not a trend. It's what we're seeing here with Internet of Things is a connected revolution, and we haven't seen a revolution like this since the Industrial Revolution of the mid-19th century.
I like that, the connected revolution. Well, let's go into some of those underlying technologies. Talk to us a little bit about 5G. For those of our listeners who don't know, what may not be familiar with that, describe what that is, and then how that would be applicable or used in a smart city.
Sure. Well, 5G is really the evolution of what we have today, 4G LTE. It's the next level, and from an engineering technical perspective, it's very interesting because it's multi-band. There's a low, mid, and high frequency band, but 5G is going to be a lot more than just upgrading your smartphone's performance. 5G is going to hopefully be able to bring wireless broadband to neighborhoods where there's less of a need to run fiber optic cable or other cable. A lot of that will just be over the air, but it's also going to, again, be one of these ingredient technologies.
Well, it's an interesting point that 5G doesn't. It means that while I'm driving, I can download my latest cat video quickly while I'm still getting that information on traffic flow and reporting back to the authorities, so they have a sense they're collecting data from me, as you noted earlier,
sure,
to help them make decisions as well. So it's that I can get my cat video, I can download my email while I'm traveling,
right,
and also have that two-way communication.
Well, video is a great example for listeners to understand what I mean by higher speed and greater bandwidth. So back in the 3G day, if you remember those days.
I'm old enough to remember those days. Thank you for pointing that out.
Well, me too. And that, believe it or not, was debuted in 2001.
Wow.
And back then, a 2-hour movie would take you over a day to download.
I remember those days.
Yes. And so then we got 4G, and we leveled up. And now it takes a few minutes. Well, 5G will be basically snap your fingers, maybe just a few seconds to download a 2-hour movie like Guardians of the Galaxy or something. Right. So that describes and that's how fast 5G. But we need it for a lot more things than just quick downloads of movies and so forth.
Artificial intelligence, how do you see that being used in the smart city concept?
Sure. Well, AI is very interesting, and we're learning a lot about it here in 2017. And again, it will really start to make an impact next decade. But AI is going to start to take on tasks that we don't want to do, like updating databases, and in a smart city context, managing a routine process, things of that nature. That's where AI will start to make an impact. It'll also help with things that we can't do, like programming a self-driving vehicle or self-driving school bus or delivery truck. There's no way that we as humans can possibly program that vehicle to anticipate and react to every conceivable eventuality on the road.
We talked earlier, you said you're seeing cities around the world sort of begin to implement some of this. I'm going to go to that, but what sort of investment are we seeing? Are the dollars sort of chasing this technology, this trend?
Sure. So the research shows, roughly around about $15 billion in smart cities technology investment around the world back in 2015. And projections expect this to more than double in 5 years. So by the time we get to the 2020 mark, we'll be closer to $34-35 billion globally. Wow. I think actually it'll be higher, just simply thinking about how things technology-wise tend to happen a little bit faster than we expect.
I guess if you're beginning to plan a city today, you take a completely different perspective than when most of the modern cities were built. When you're building New York at the turn of the 18th century in the late 1700s or so, you want to optimize for wagons and horses and housing that allows for some level of agriculture. Completely different today. So to your point, I guess if you're in some of these. I'll call them developing nations, but it's hard to call China a developing nation. But with more development to be done, it's one thing. But if you look to some of these Western cities, particularly that are in more crowded environments, it must be more of a challenge. But yet we know in Europe that there's some great cities in Europe that are beginning to implement these technologies. What are we seeing in the Western world where you've got that legacy infrastructure and you've got some of the constraints of geographic space?
Great. Well, this is why wireless and 5G is going to be so critically important as a key ingredient, and because it's going to be very difficult to lay new cable and so forth, and you have really the city footprint, if you like, is very, very well established. So wireless technologies will help a lot with the connections, but then I think also there may be parking garages that are no longer required. So that's torn down and a park is built. Trees are planted.
Before we wrap up, I do want to just hit a couple other of the difficult challenges. Interoperability among these systems, and is there a need for standards? Whether it's within the systems within a specific urban environment, New York, London, et cetera, or even to enable citizens to move back and forth and still have the same level of service or expectations. Are we seeing are we seeing work done in these areas?
We are, in fact, and I'm glad you brought up standards because I think standards are going to be crucial to the broader deployment of smart cities because, everybody, it's not going to work as well if everybody has their own take and their own approach. So, and again, where to look for this is around these ingredient technologies. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of standards work going on in Japan, for example, around 5G. They're looking for deployment of that for the 2020 Tokyo Olympics. Also, different standards for different aspects of other technologies. So yes, standards are voluntary though, but there are a number of entities around the world that are working on these and looking to be the one to set the standard. And our own standards group will invariably become absorbed in some of those works, I would expect.
And the last challenge I want to get to, and this came up in some of the research I was doing, have you ever read the book by Professor Ed Glazer from Harvard, The Triumph of the Cities?
I know it, yes.
Yeah, it's a great book about cities and why they're important. And one of his theses is that what makes cities so special is that you bring all these people together in one space. And so that allows for these connections that lead to whether it's deeper insights in intelligence or in innovation, or whether it's simply just sort of increasing our understanding of each other and whatnot, because you're in that cramped space. And others talk about the cities have a soul that comes along because you have people coming in together and they create the city in as much as the infrastructure does by that interaction of humanity. And so there's a concern about will the smart cities take away that humanity, that soul? And what does it mean to be human in sort of a modern smart city? Thoughts? No specific question. I'm sorry. I'm just throwing it out there. I'll just dump it on your lap.
Honestly, I think when you think about automation and some of the topics that we've talked about around robotics, self-driving vehicles, AI, et cetera, ostensibly, citizens are going to have more time for fun and artistic potentially pursuits and things of that nature. So the other part about smart cities is why are urban areas and cities interested in this is the economic development. What city doesn't want to be attractive to businesses, attractive to highly educated people to live there and contribute to their society?
What excites you most about the smart cities concept, and what technology have you seen that you've been like, wow, that's really going to be pretty cool, that's really going to be beneficial?
Well, to me, it's the self-driving vehicle, really, because like we said before, the mobility benefits are just the tip of the iceberg. Then you have less of a need for these superhighways and less of a need for parking garages and all these derivative benefits that are just going to flow from the implementation of that technology.
Well, I want to thank Steve for being with us today on our CTA podcast, looking at smart cities and their impact. We didn't get to, there's so many ancillary benefits. We didn't talk about energy management and energy flow, water management, just the ability to provide those resources in a much more efficient, cost-effective way because of the centralization. It's going to completely transform our cities, and hopefully maybe in another 40 years we'll waddle in here or we don't even have to meet face to face, right? We can send our avatars to have the discussion while we sit in our nursing home or whatever. Join us for more after just a few words from our sponsor. This podcast brought to you by Dell, giving the modern workforce everything they need to securely connect, produce, and collaborate from anywhere at any time. Dell Technologies offers the industry's most comprehensive and innovative in-user portfolio, from individual workers to organizations of all sizes. Don't miss the Dell experience at CES. Every experience becomes more cinematic with Dell's latest virtual reality, PC gaming, and innovative computing experiences. January 9th through the 11th from 10 to 5 at the Yardbird within the Venetian. Follow Breaking Dell News online at #DellExperience. According to some research, in 1950, only 30% of the world's population lived in cities. It rose to about 54% in 2014, and by 2050, a full two-thirds of humankind is expected to live in cities. As outlined in CTA's The Evolution of Smart Cities and Connected Communities study, we found that with 70% of the world's population forecast to live in cities by 2050, the need for sustainable, livable world cities is essential for a prosperous future. Now, those of us who live where I live in Washington, D.C. or other big cities, sustainable and livable means, in part, reducing traffic and addressing mobility challenges. Ford estimates that we'll have over 800 million cars on roads today, and that could rise to 2 to 4 billion by mid-century. And that in major metropolitan areas, we spend about a week of our year it's stuck in traffic. And in the Washington area, I can attest to that for sure. As the number of people moving into urban centers continues to grow, it affects not only the movement of people and resources, but also this is about the environment, about urban planning, about economic growth, and overall quality of life in these cities. Smart, self-driving, and shared mobility may all be part of the mobility solution as part of an overall approach to smart cities. And our guest today will help us explore the promise and some of the roadblocks towards next-generation mobility. Our guest today is John Kwant, who's Vice President of City Solutions with Ford Smart Mobility. John leads Ford's global efforts to partner with cities and municipalities to identify key urban mobility needs that help inform Ford's development of new services, while also working to create and implement new mobility solutions in cities worldwide. John plays a key role in connecting Ford's internal capabilities and works with their external partners to identify opportunities that will leverage the company's history and resources in its interactions with cities and address some of these challenges. John previously worked in a variety of government affairs and business development roles since he joined Ford in 1999, most recently serving as Director of Global Strategy, where he focused on smart mobility initiatives. He holds a MBA and an MSc from Northwestern University and a BSc in Industrial and Operations Engineering from the University of Michigan. So please join me this morning in welcoming John Kwant. John, thanks for joining us on our podcast.
Thank you for having me. Look forward to talking with you.
Well, maybe we should just start with the top. Can you give us some context for the need and promise of smart mobility solutions? I talked about traffic. I have to admit that's very personal and very selfish given where I live. But what are the problems we're trying to solve as we talk about next-gen mobility? What is mobile gridlock in this context?
Well, I have a lot of empathy for what you face in D.C. because I did live there for 3 years, and I commuted the 17 miles from Potomac to our office on 14th and I every day.
17 miles, which took you 2 hours?
It was an hour and a half most days each way,
and
it was essentially when you took that down, you're essentially traveling less than 10 miles an hour, and it was something that if it did not act as inspiration, it certainly served as motivation for some of the roles that I've assumed here at Ford since. But I think, getting back to one of the things that you said early on in the introduction, this notion of if we're going to believe the studies and what the demographers are saying about 60 to 70% of the world's population coming to cities by 2050, we believe that's only going to happen if you actually open up those cities and change the transportation paradigm that exists right now. It's a real paradox that cities are facing because they'll continue to grow, but they'll only be able to grow, in our words, if you're actually able to move. If the city is going to be gridlocked, you have to begin to look at how do you change that paradigm and increase the carrying capacity of a city so that it can accept all these new people that are coming in. It's already struggling with the people that are there. How can they grow by another 10 or 20%? If people and goods aren't moving in that system. So we spend a lot of time here talking about this notion of carrying capacity and how can we redefine how many cars we can carry on a road. How do we encourage shared mobility and platforms that we can build? How can we help cities orchestrate, that movement of people and goods so that it's managed more efficiently? And we think there are ways that we can help cities with that and get more goods and services flowing through a city.
Well, let's dive into some of the specifics. So what are some of those solutions? How are you defining this next chapter of mobility?
So for us, it starts. It's a journey. We would say that from this point forward, the world's kind of on a journey toward automated vehicles, both for moving people and goods around, and it's a matter of how long that journey is going to take. But we think two important steps on that journey, especially in urban settings, is this notion of shared mobility. Much like they embrace to a large degree today, whether it's through trains or buses. Or carpooling, if you will. That notion isn't a new one. It's a matter of how do we encourage it in even more forms, and maybe even change, some of the transit options that are out there and offer an increasing array of them. So that's one step. The other notion here is that as vehicles become yet another node on the Internet of Things, how do we take things like modes and roads and modes include, cars, buses, bikes, everything that's moving, and the infrastructure that it's all connected to, and make that all part of the Internet of Things. And so this increasing connectivity between all of that will help in this notion of orchestration, because we can now begin to manage higher carrying capacity vessels, if you will, that get people in and out, get goods in and out, and begin to time things. So those are some of the things that we're working on. One solution, quite honestly, that is a very simple one, was the acquisition of Chariot, a shuttle service that operates started in San Francisco. It's operating in Austin, Seattle, and New York, is where we've launched. And it's essentially a service that crowdsources its routes based on commuters who join in, and they determine the routes of where they can pick up people where there's the most demand, and people can book a seat on the shuttle, actually reserve a seat, and then take that to their destination, or actually near their destination. And it's a way that in the same footprint that you would have a car, we now have a van, which, by the way, we make transit vans. And so for us, it's just a natural extension of our value chain. We make the van, and instead of just selling it or leasing it, to a service, we've now kind of extended our own value chain as a company to actually get into the transportation business as well.
It's an amazing thing. You're originally started as a manufacturing business for automobiles. You've moved to become a technology company, and now you're becoming this transportation industry as well, part of the transportation industry as well. How is Chariot doing in those cities in which it's operating? It's in Austin, Seattle, and San Francisco, correct?
Yep, and we launched New York last Thursday.
And how's the response been?
The response has been great, because I think people understand the value proposition and understand it, and even transit officials can understand that it can be accretive to transit. It's not taking people off transit necessarily. It's this notion of you've got more people coming, and we can only pack so many single occupancy vehicles on a road. I think one of the things that we try and do with cities is to actually collaborate with them. And not be disruptive. We're not coming into cities with our solutions and just plopping them in. We're actually having discussions with all of those cities well beforehand to understand what are the business models within Chariot, because they have a commuter model, they have a business-to-business model where they actually transport employees to and from, and we have they have a event model where they actually do chartered events, for, let's say, sporting events, or if you're in San Francisco, the vans go out to wine country and take people out there. But we actually engage with city officials in each of the markets that we've launched in to understand what's the best model to launch with, how do we grow, how do we prove to them that this is actually helping take single occupancy vehicles out of the system at key times.
Where are we on the road to self-driving? You sort of think about it as a roadmap, and as Ford and some of your competitors have introduced some of the autonomous technology into the car. Where are we in terms of incorporating that technology, and how close are we to seeing truly self-driving vehicles on the roadways?
Well, I think we're on our way. That journey has started some time ago. The example I like to use with people is if you drive a car right now and you have something we call variable cruise control, it's amazing. Like when I take trips from Detroit to Chicago or head up north for 4 or 5 hour drives. I was actually back in DC this weekend. It's amazing when you set that and it self-regulates itself in a north-south fashion, right? So it'll slow down and leave the appropriate gap in between you. You realize how close we are to having the car really be able to drive on its own. The only thing that it doesn't have right now are like the lateral movements, although we do have safety technologies that detect, when a car is in the lane next to you so that, it reads your blind spot and things. So the detection methods are there. It's just a matter of kind of tying it all together. We've got those technologies now that we're deploying. Plus, any number of companies that are in this space have already deployed those vehicles, and they're running around public roads. We have them here in Dearborn. There's still drivers there in the event that they have to take over, but the technologies are being tested on public roads. So I think, as I said, if this path that we're on is toward an autonomous future at some point, 10, 20 years hence, where in larger scale people are using these things, I think what we're seeing now is the proving of the technologies. And as we get more people engaged in utilizing shared modes and more things become connected, it provides the plumbing and the infrastructure that's going to be required to deploy AVs at a larger scale.
We're almost out of time here, but just another quick question. What excites you most is you get to see this broad landscape. You get to see the integration of all these different technologies as potential solutions. What are you most excited about?
What I'm most excited about and being part of this company is I don't want to make it sound so deep, but there is this moral obligation to help kind of solve some of the problems that us and others have created, and how, in order to preserve the future of mobility, how do we do that? And to be thinking as creatively and open as this company is, that's what kind of gets me excited.
Smart cities will be a major theme at the upcoming CES 2018 this January. You can go to ces.tech to learn more about smart cities at CES and everything CES. And welcome back to CES Tech Talk. We're continuing our discussion of smart cities, which will be one of the key themes at the upcoming CES 2018 this January. Joining me today is Frank Sgambati, the Director of Business Development, Smart Cities at Robert Bosch LLC. Frank, you've had a long career in automotive. You've been with Bosch since 1998, where you served in several management roles. And interestingly, he began his career as a plant engineer with Dow Chemicals. He holds a BS in mechanical engineering from Michigan Technological University. Frank, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thanks, Jeff. Thanks for having me. My pleasure.
Great to have you, and great to have Bosch participate in CES. So let's just start at the beginning. We've talked a lot here on our podcast about smart cities. We've talked with representatives from Ford. We've talked with our researchers. And I think the fundamental question to sort of set the stage is, how does Bosch define a smart city? What does that mean to you in the work that you're doing?
Sure. The way Bosch looks at a smart city situation is, what we're trying to do is utilize our technology solutions and the portfolio of software, hardware solution sets that we can bring to kind of create what we would call an interconnected ecosystem that works to try and optimize the overall performance and increase the efficiency and quality of life for cities. So we're focused on sustainability, economic development, optimized city usage, whether it's city infrastructure, and trying to overall, the target and ultimate goal is to improve the quality of life for citizens in cities.
That's great. We talk a lot about how technology is, we call it "Let's Go Humans," how technology has helped improve the human condition. Yeah, I like that language you use, optimizing performance, increase efficiency and quality of life. But what does that mean on the ground in actual application? What are the technologies driving that vision of smart city?
Sure. Where Bosch is very active is, we're taking the sensors, the things, and then we're working towards the Internet of Things, so the IoT, and creating another layer between software and cloud services, and ultimately trying to bring to cities and communities solutions and services. And we're kind of focused in 5 areas. So the 5 areas of focus that we are in the smart city space is energy, building, mobility, security, and what we would call e-governance. And you're probably wondering, what does e-governance mean? Well, e-governance is some of the platforms and software solutions that we can bring to city officials and city employees in kind of a city dashboard type layout to allow them to make decisions on policy and planning for city operations.
Sort of integrating that smart city approach on a dashboard to allow them to have an overview and interact. Can you give a specific example of how that might work, maybe in the area of traffic control, for example? Yes,
certainly. So in the area of, let's say, in traffic control, so one of the Bosch solutions we can bring to cities is in the area of our security cameras. So our security cameras, in a traditional sense, have been used for security and safety reasons. But what we're also finding with some of our latest technology cameras is we do what we call edge computing. So we're actually doing the processing in the camera, not only utilizing the video data feeds that a traditional security camera can provide, but then also we're able to do things like utilizing the metadata. So we can anonymize some of the data for things like people counting. Mm-hmm. We can do traffic monitoring. In a traffic intersection, we can actually determine when there's a pedestrian coming up to an intersection and coming up to a crosswalk. And this information then can be utilized by city officials. So the number of pedestrians, for example, utilizing a crosswalk, that information may be then put into some kind of a dashboard or even like a heat map. And then cities can determine, utilization and let's say at crosswalks. And this information can be displayed in a dashboard, or even as most of us have today, a smartphone. So we can even include it on a smartphone app for citizens that are, for city employees that may be out in the field, for example.
Hey, so yes, I'm going to say it and make the bad joke. It's smart governance for smart cities.
Here you go.
Which we could use a lot of. I guess I should also make the bad joke. Is this theoretical, or are you actually implementing this technology on the ground?
We're working with several different cities at the moment in different communities where we've got some of the pieces that we've actually deployed. But I would say we're in some early stages, and to be quite honest, we're working closely with cities and some of the decision makers in cities. At cities, as they kind of went through this U.S. DOT Smart Cities Challenge, they've reorganized themselves, and you see that in several different cities that have been progressive. Where they've set up certain offices in the mayor's office, chief innovation officer, as an example. And so what we're doing is we're working closely with them to determine where they have certain pain points in the cities and certain needs. And then, these solutions, such as a city dashboard based on data provided from a Bosch camera, can then help them, make some smarter solution implementation.
Right. We'll come back to that and dig down to that. I know you've got some pilot projects, and I want to ask some questions about those. But let's go back to that wide array of areas in which you're working. You mentioned mobility. Can you talk a little bit about the work you're doing there, and then tie it back to sort of the benefits for cities and for the citizenry of cities?
Yeah. So cities, in many regards, are trying to do a couple things, and maybe in the area of mobility that might be interesting, as cities are trying to move towards electrification of their city fleet vehicles. What we can provide as a solution is we provide a suite of EV charging stations. So we have going from all the way from a residential solution, like a level 2 type charger, which is something that you and I would have maybe in our home or maybe our apartment or condo, all the way up to what we would call a DC fast charging station. So we have a 25 kilowatt DC fast charger that we feel provides enough, increase in charging time for, let's say, public spaces, whether it's parking structures or even in city streets. So we're working closely with cities and communities and the city partners to deploy the EV infrastructure in preparation for the electrification of not only the city fleets, but in the long term, also the electrification of the general fleet, the general public fleet. So that's a great example of some of the solutions that we're working on in the mobility space.
And I assume that again ties back into the e-governance dashboard, so that city planners, city officials, traffic officials can monitor that traffic, respond in real time, send out messaging in real time, et cetera.
Yeah, certainly. So one of the things we're also doing with go back to the EV charging infrastructure that is being set up in cities and in communities. So there's the back end services and some of the brokerage needs. So we're going to need to be able to have a seamless process for paying for EV charging station usage. In many of, let's say, year to date or up to now, a lot of the charging stations have been free of charge. But as going forward, that's probably going to change. So there's some discussions about new business models that we're working on with cities and how we can, support deploying an electrification system, and not only just the hardware, but even some of the software and the IT solutions in the back end.
And the system and monetizing that to help pay for the infrastructure development.
Exactly. Exactly.
That's great. Yeah. Well, I live outside of Washington, D.C. We're located right outside of Washington, D.C. And I've talked earlier in this podcast about the growth of cities. As I'm sure you know, the estimates that by 2050, 2/3 of humans will live in cities, some 6 billion people here. The congestion, the traffic is horrible. I understand that 30% of urban congestion is caused by the search for parking. And in Washington, D.C., it is a proverbial pain in the rear to find good parking. How's Bosch involved in that part of the mobility equation as well?
Yeah, in the mobility space, people think of, let's say, moving, along, city streets and how we can try and improve overall traffic flow. But to your point, parking, which is part of the mobility experience, and it's not always a good experience.
Or the anti-mobility, as it were, right?
Yeah, exactly. But, parking solutions, we're working on what we would call smart parking and connected parking solutions. So there's things that we're looking at in the areas of, really 3 areas of potential focus. The first being really active parking lot management, where you and I can, try and improve the search and, let's say, the search capabilities of trying to find a parking space, making that much easier and more seamless, and trying to reduce that 30% traffic that is contributed by people searching for parking. That's one example. We're also working with some of our, I go back to my mobility days, and we're working with some of our customers from the OEM, the original equipment manufacturers, on possible solutions for utilizing vehicle onboard sensors to actually find street parking and availability of, on-street parking in cities and urban areas. So for example, as your car is passing an empty parking space, maybe that information then can be somehow through a cloud, and then eventually through, let's say, an app kind of a situation. That information then can be broadcast to other folks searching for a parking space, and they would know at maybe certain intersection they can find a parking space that's available. That's probably the second area in the smart parking. And then in the long term, we're also working on what we would call automated valet parking. So we just announced that we've set up a pilot project with our partner Daimler and their museum in Germany, and we're actually able to showcase just an early example of what maybe the future may look like when it comes to a situation where you and I would come up to a parking structure, we would exit our vehicle, and the vehicle would then go off and park itself, and then when we're ready to call our vehicle, we would come back to that drop-off location, and the car would be there, and then we're off on our way.
Well, look, Frank, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in January at CES 2018. We've been talking smart cities with Frank Sgambati, who's the Director of Business Development and Smart City at Robert Bosch, LLC. Frank, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you for listening to CES Tech Talk. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss an episode. You can get more information on the CES show in January at ces.tech. Our show is produced by Tina Anthony, John Lindsay is our sound engineer, and me, I'm Jeff Joseph. This podcast brought to you by Dell, giving the modern workforce everything they need to securely connect, produce, and collaborate from anywhere at any time. Dell Technologies offers the industry's most comprehensive and innovative in-user portfolio, from individual workers to organizations of all sizes.